Today I'm colouring an image with ink smooshing in a controlled way. Hello there, Michelle Short here with Terrific Tags with Michelle. I'm here on the Altenew YouTube channel on the first and third Saturday of the month. So if you like my videos, I'd love for you to subscribe. So let's get started. I'm using the Botanical Elegance Capture the Colours of Nature watercolour colouring book. This is a colouring book where there are lots of images printed onto watercolour paper. It's 5 by 7 inches in size, and each image you get a kind of lighter line with more of a grey tone, and then you also get one with darker black lines, and I'm using one with darker black lines today. The reason I'm using this as opposed to a stamped image is purely just because I happen to love the image and I don't have a stamp in this design, but ordinarily I would do this technique with a stamped image. I want to cut this panel down, and I've got a piece of tracing paper that is cut to 4¼ inches by 5½ inches, and because this is see-through, I use this quite often to gauge where I want to cut down a panel. So I've placed it onto the image panel, and now I can kind of see through it and make some marks with a pencil to see where I want to cut it down. I am going to cut it down just slightly bigger at the moment than the A2 size, just so that I've got a little bit of wiggle room if I need it. I then want to add some colour onto this image, and I thought I would do that with ink smooshing, but I want to do it in a more controlled way. So I've got a piece of acetate here. This could be anything that's clear, old packaging, stamp pocket, anything like that. I'm taking my ink pad. This is Pinkalicious Fresh Dye ink, and I have smooshed a little bit of that onto the acetate. I'm now going to spray a little bit of water on top. I can flip over that acetate, and then I can smoosh it down onto the panel, hence the name ink smooshing. This is a great way to add colour onto an image so that you can kind of get a little bit of an organic look. You've kind of got a little bit of like a splattery look type thing. You can do this in a few different ways. I'm going for more of a kind of splattery look today, but you could definitely go for more of a coverage type look as well if you wanted to. You would just want to add more ink onto that acetate. But I'm going in slow to start with, adding just the tiniest little bit of the ink, smooshing that down onto the panel, and then I'm drying it now with a heat tool. I don't need this to be completely dry, but I do just want to make sure that I don't kind of move the layer that I've already done when I then add something else on top. So I've gone in again with a little bit more of that ink, and then I can press that down onto the image. And you can see here that I've got kind of little splashes of that colour on that acetate. So I can manipulate those and press those down onto the image exactly where I want them. I could never achieve this look with a paintbrush. It just isn't in my way to be able to do that. But it's great that I can use this method to be able to colour in this image exactly how I want it to be. The kind of traditional way of ink smooshing is that you would add the ink onto a craft mat, and then you would kind of push your image into that ink, but the kind of downside of that is that you can't actually see where you're adding that ink. So it's great for backgrounds, but not so great to colour in images. I've gone on to my second layer here with my second colour, and that's hydrangea. So I've added a little bit more this time. I've got a little bit more brave with adding that colour on. So I've added a little bit more that time. I have heat set that, and now I can go in with the next colour, which is turquoise. I thought that these three colours would work really nicely together. In the past, I have done this technique with kind of rainbow colours. So you can definitely go all out with lots of different colours if you wanted to. Today I'm just using the three, and I've specifically picked three colours that I know blend quite nicely together. Pink, purple and blue always blend nicely, so that's why I'm going with those today. So I'm adding that colour there onto kind of like the bottom right hand side, and then I can heat set that as well. I wanted a little bit more interest onto the panel, so I'm going to go in with some slightly darker shades now. So I'm going in with Razzleberry, but I want to add just the minimal amount of this colour. So I barely just place that down onto that acetate. I can spray that with some water, but I am adding a little bit less water this time. And I'm really kind of folding up that acetate on itself so that I don't get kind of lines of colour on my image. And I can really manipulate where I'm pressing down those little pools of colour. Again, I'm going to heat set that. So I've just got the tiniest little bit of darker areas, but it's quite nice just to have that interest between the slightly lighter shade and then the slightly darker shade. So I'm going to do the same thing for the purple, and I'm using ultraviolet here. Again, just adding the tiniest little amount onto that acetate, spraying it with a little bit of water, and then I can press that down onto the image. And I'm going quite faint, I suppose, with my colours. They're not that bright, and I'm not adding a huge amount of them, but you can definitely add more if you want to. It's kind of a great technique. It's quite forgiving in a way, because although technically I suppose you can mess up, no one would ever know if you actually messed up, because it would just look intentional, which is always a great thing. I'm now going in with Tide Blue. Now in hindsight, I wish that I'd gone in with a slightly darker shade of blue here. Once this dries, these two colours do end up sort of blending into each other, so it just looks like there's the one shade on it. I didn't actually realise that until I'd put all the card together. If I'd noticed it once I'd heat set it, then I could have gone in with a darker shade, but never mind, I do still like how it turned out. For the sentiment, I'm going to stamp it down onto some cold press watercolour paper. The reason I'm using the watercolour paper today is purely just so that the cardstock that I used for the image panel and the sentiment are just going to match. Otherwise, I don't specifically need to use watercolour paper at this point. I just like to have my cardstocks match each other. So I've placed a piece of that into the stamp wheel. I'm going to stamp the sentiment that says Happy Birthday from the Sincere Sentiments stamp set. So I'm just placing that over the cardstock. Then I can bring in the top flip plate of my stamp wheel here, pop it in place, and that's going to pick up that stamp. I can then flip that over and ink up the stamp using Obsidian pigment ink. So I'm just inking up this sentiment here with the ink. I can then flip that over and then press that down onto the cardstock. And although I'm using the slightly smoother side of the watercolour paper, it is still textured, so I do need to stamp this a couple of times just to make sure that I get a really nice dark impression. So I can just stamp that again. And then I'm going to let that dry just for a couple of minutes before I cut that down. I'm using the Halftone Circles Nesting die set, and I'm going to cut this down into a circle. So I've placed that over the sentiment, and I've held that down with some low tack tape, and then I can run that through my die cutting machine. I can then pop that out. And I'm going to make this into a little tag. So I'm going to make a mark there towards the top of the circle with a pencil. And I'm going to use this as a guide to cut out a little hole. So I've got a handheld hole punch here. And I'm just using that to create the hole in the top of the tag. I can then grab some twine. I have folded that in half and then pushed that through the hole of the tag. I can secure that in place at the front of the tag, and then I can tie that in a bow. And if you've watched any of my videos, you'll see that I make bows almost on every single card. I do really like how this twine looks for bows in particular, especially on tags. So I'm just fiddling that, getting it to the size that I want, and then I can cut those tails down. So that is my sentiment ready to go. my image panel is kind of drying off to the side, and I want to create my card base. So I've got a panel of Crafty Necessities jet black cardstock, and I can add some glue tape onto the back of that, and I can adhere that down onto an A2 size white card base. So that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. Now, I don't necessarily need to have a white card base. I could do this just with black cardstock to make a card base, but this cardstock is a little bit thin for my personal taste in terms of making it into a card base. But the great thing about adding the panel on top of a white card base is that it's white inside, so it's really easy to write a personal message. That is quite helpful. But from the front, it's just going to look like a card base made from black cardstock. So I'm using that now as a guide to cut my image panel down. I want to have a strip of the black cardstock showing on the right hand side. I can now adhere my panel down onto the card base using instant dimension foam tape. Because this panel is quite large, I want to make sure that I cover the entire back of this panel with the foam tape. The downside of using foam tape for a large area like this is that if you pop the card in the mail, it does sometimes get a little bit squished. So the way to try and get around that for me is to use a lot of foam tape, and you could say that this is a little bit wasteful in terms of the foam tape, but I'd rather the card arrived safely and not squished than not adding enough foam tape. You could definitely do this with lots of layers of cardstock, but it does add quite a lot of weight to the card, and here in the UK, if your card weighs more, it does cost more in postage, and foam tape is a little bit lighter even if you've used this amount. So I can remove the backings off of that foam tape, and then I can adhere that down onto the card, and I'm just kind of placing them down onto my craft mat here so that I can try and sort of line them up as best as possible. Just trying to sort of move that here so I can see if I've got any areas there where it's not completely straight. So I've got a little bit of time here just to wiggle it in place, and then I can press that down. I can then add some more foam tape onto the back of my sentiment tag. I can remove the backings off of that foam tape, and I can adhere that down onto the card. Now, ordinarily, I probably wouldn't usually place my sentiment up sort of here in this position. I'd usually go for something a little bit lower, especially more in the right hand corner, but I felt that it worked quite nicely with this image. So just popping that down, using a T-square ruler there just to make sure that that sentiment is straight. And then I can finish off by embellishing with some black enamel dots. And I'm using the perfect picker here to pick those up and place them down onto the card. And I wasn't sure of the placement here of these enamel dots, so I'm placing them down very, very lightly so that if I need to move them, I can. But I thought it was just quite a nice way to sort of adding a little bit more of the black colour into the image. So the kind of card is sort of black and white, and then the pops of the colours with the ink smooshing. So I'm pretty happy with the placement of the enamel dots so that I can press those down. And that is the card finished for today. Really quite clean and simple, but I do like how that ink smooshing works to colour in the image. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on the Altenew blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Hey there, Lydia here. I really do hope that you've just enjoyed the video. If so, please subscribe to the Altenew YouTube channel. Also, turn on the notification bell so you can get your daily dose of crafty techniques and tutorials just like this. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.